Hello friends, today by listener request we'll discuss this. The accident of Pan International Flight 112 happened on September 6, 1972 in Germany. So what is it about? Let's go back to that period in history. It's the Cold War. Germany is divided, East Germany, West Germany, and in West Germany things are starting to go well. We are in what was called the post-war boom years. Europeans' purchasing power at that time was doubling every few years. So, in Germany, a travel industry was born during the 1960s, and only a few tens of thousands of people traveled by plane. By the early 1970s, there were millions of them, and this has never changed up to now. And in fact, what Germany invented was the all-inclusive trip. That means you go to an agency and then they sell you the plane ticket, so the flight. They have their own company, and then they sell you. Also included in the package are the hotel, the beach, transfers from the airport, and the food. And actually, if you look nowadays, you have pretty similar systems, for example, with TUI. TUI, the agency, the German agency that allows you to have vacations with your family almost anywhere in the world. When you pay once and everything's included with nothing else to worry about, it's very appealing. Moreover, as I was saying at that time, a lot of agencies and airlines will emerge. So there are two things you also need to know. On one hand, there are tax incentives because Germany absolutely wants to develop its transport sector. So there are a lot of tax incentives that sometimes even become the driving force. That means there have been times when airlines were created not to transport passengers, but only to take advantage of tax incentives. Truth be told, if you bought, let's say, a plane back then, you would then depreciate it. You would see it depreciate over the years. Well, you could pocket from the tax authorities up to almost 2.5 times your initial investment. That means that in the end, we reached a point where the plane was really just a pretext. And that day, you'll see, with the story of Pan International, the depreciation of this aircraft will happen extremely quickly. Another thing, there were a lot. I'm not saying there isn't any today, but at the time there was endemic corruption in what was called the FRG, West Germany, and in fact politicians, members of parliament took money to protect airlines that had no business being in the air, that had no business being in airports, that were clearly and frankly dangerous. But it was about paying the right people, the slush funds of political parties, election campaigns, and generally you got silence. So what will happen with this company is that if we go back 2 or 3 days before December 6th, before September 6th, 1972, we have a Boeing 707 undergoing maintenance, so it's out in the open at an airport. And then it's going to undergo, I think it was in Dusseldorf, and it's going to undergo maintenance. This maintenance requires emptying the tanks, so they're going to bring in a truck. The truck is going to start pumping the fuel tanks, it's going to empty them, and then it leaves. Afterwards, the mechanics and their manager arrive, they look, and they realize there's still a bit of fuel left in the tanks. There wasn't much left, just a few dozen liters at the bottom that the truck's pump couldn't reach, so they had to find a way to empty them. And then what they're going to do is something that's extremely dangerous in aviation, because aviation is a very complex system, so everything has to be structured, organized, and codified. And what they're going to do is improvise. Now, when you improvise, maybe the improvisation will work where you did it. There's no problem with that. But what effect will it have on the system as a whole? That's another matter. So they're going to go into one of the hangars at the airport. They're going to find some small 60-liter barrels and they're going to bring them back. So they're going to roll them under the plane. They're going to look for the drains and they're going to start draining the plane. So the Boeing 707, they're going to drain it of its fuel until the tanks are completely empty. And actually, while doing this, the fuel that's recovered, the kerosene, will be put into these barrels. So there are 2 barrels that are completely filled, others that are partially filled, and then they're going to roll them to the hangar in question. These barrels had no labels, nothing at all. They were completely unmarked barrels. So the Boeing 707 undergoes maintenance, returns to service, and leaves our story. The Boeing 707 is no longer of interest to us from now on. Enter the BFC 111. It's an aircraft you don't see much of today. I think there aren't any left flying. It's a twin-engine airliner, and from a distance it looked similar to a Caravelle or even a DC-9. They don't make many planes like this anymore today. It was the kind of aircraft where both engines were placed all the way at the back. It was made by the British, and an important detail, it was equipped with two Rolls-Royce Spey engines. So this plane, what it does, well, it's used here and there mainly to transport German tourists to sunny destinations. What we're going to do is, we need water for this aircraft. Why? Because there was a system, it doesn't exist anymore. Although there's still one plane, it still exists. I'll tell you in a second. Back then, if we go back to the 60s and 70s, we had jet aviation was expanding. Some jet engines, which were even found on the first Boeing 747s, for example, actually required what was called water injection. If you look at old aviation books and all that, you'll find entire chapters on water injection. So what was it? It was that you took distilled water, you filled a tank with distilled water that was somewhere in the plane, and then in the cockpit, the pilots had a button, they pressed it. There are pumps that inject water into the engine. So depending on the engine, it was usually injected, like in the SPs, it's injected into the last stage of the compressor. So we have nozzles, we inject water, which will have the following effect. It will cool the turbines a bit, because the limiting problem with those engines was that the turbines tended to overheat and then limit the power. That means if, let's say, the turbine exceeds a certain temperature, it will start to be destroyed or damaged. So we limit the maximum temperature of the turbine so that if it's a day when the plane is heavy, it's hot and all that, it's true that the turbine temperature becomes a limiting factor. So to get past this factor, what did we do? We prepared for takeoff. So when we did the takeoff performance like today, we calculate V1 VR, V2 the takeoff distances, accelerate stop distances, all that. Well, back then in the charts you find from those times, you'll see with water injection or without water injection. And the advantage was that if you injected water, it allowed you to have a bit more power, which let you carry more load. So for this aircraft, it was probably a ton and a half more that it could carry if it injected water. And if it didn't inject water, well, it was a bit less. All right, I was telling you that this system is completely outdated. Today we have engines that are very powerful and we don't need to inject water into them. However, there is still one aircraft that uses this. It's the B-52. The BBC-2, which, by the way, some are currently being renovated with new engines from Rolls-Royce that don't need injection. But up until now, most of the BBC-2S still using the old engines need water injection. And since they have 8 engines, and these are engines with fragile turbines that need to be cooled, there is a huge difference in power between using water injection and not using water injection. That means as soon as the plane accelerates and they open the water valves, they suddenly get a power boost. Without the water, that power will suddenly drop because there's a regulator that manages the engine based on the turbine temperature. It's the only plane using this today. Anyway, the barrels I'm talking about, the ones I'm telling you about, are filled up. For the ones that are half full, we'll add more water to them, and then we'll load all of them onto a plane, onto the BAC 111 that we're interested in. At first, we'll load them into the cargo hold. Okay, so the aircraft makes several flights with these barrels in the cargo hold. And at some point, what we do is we need to carry out a flight. So the flight we needed to carry out was departing from Hamburg, and then it had to go to Malaga. Subtitling. What we do is we open the cargo hold, we take out these barrels, and then with a manual pump, we send 300 liters of water into the injection tank. In reality, what we sent was a mixture of water and kerosene in some 60-liter drums that were completely full. So actually, we end up with the tank that's probably half water, half kerosene. So, for your information, how this water and kerosene will go into the tank is that generally they separate. They separate into 2 phases. It's like when you mix oil and vinegar, you'll see that they separate. Well, similarly, the dense water will go to the bottom and the kerosene will go on top. The pump that allows water injection into the engine takes water from the very bottom of the tank. That means at first, when we start the injection, it will take water. And it's exactly at some point when there's no more water that we'll end up with kerosene coming in. So, roughly, the tank holds about 400 liters, okay? Which is enough for just one heavy takeoff. So, that's it. It's 300, 400 liters that are injected per takeoff when the plane is heavy. Now, the aircraft is going to line up on the runway. There are about 122 people on board. Actually, not about, there are exactly 122 people on board. And what they're going to do is the pilots will throttle up, trigger the injection, and they'll start accelerating. He's accelerating, everything is going normally. Rotation, starting to climb. Landing gear retract. They reach about 700 to 800 feet, and what will happen? We can guess. At some point, the pump that handles the injection ends up reaching the part where there's only kerosene. And it starts to injecting kerosene into the last stage of the compressor. So you realize the air in the compressor is very hot. The air from the turbines is even hotter. But the air from the compressors in a jet engine is very hot. Why? Because it's compressed. So when you take ambient air and start to compress it, well, gradually, you see, like with a bike pump, for example, as you go, it gets hotter and hotter. So you realize that when we inject it in there, well, it's almost going to catch fire spontaneously. So we're going to have the compressor discs that will literally act like turbines. They're going to start receiving tremendous pressure and fire and all that, plus the fuel that's added inside the combustion chamber and everything. So literally, you could say that the moment the fuel was injected, in just 2 or 3 seconds, the engines had shut down. That's it. That's it. If it had happened on the ground, it would have been better, right? Maybe during acceleration, it would have given the chance to stop. Except that unfortunately, because of those 2 separation phases, well, the plane received pure water at first. The pilots suddenly find themselves with a double engine failure. So imagine, they've just taken off, double engine failure. The only thing they see in front of them is a highway. It's the A7 and a national road that stretches out a bit to their right like that. What are they going to do? Right away, they're going to turn towards the national road. So they arrive, they look, there's the part that goes off, that moves away from them. But there, it's full of cars that are driving. The other one, where normally vehicles would be coming toward them, is empty, and that's the one they'll choose to land on. So what they're going to do is, they're going to try to... The passengers, of course, didn't realize it happened too fast. You know, it was takeoff, then coming back into land, and after that, we started to fall. So they're heading back toward the ground in a glide. They end up hitting the highway really hard. They barely avoid some high voltage power lines, but they are going to crash. The craft is going to crash at some point because it goes under a bridge. Literally, the plane goes under a bridge. And so it starts to break apart. It's going to come apart. It's going to split into 2 or 3 pieces and spin around. And then, that's it. And it catches fire. Now, the fire didn't start immediately. It took a few minutes. So that gave some time for the evacuation. About 22 or 23 people died in this accident. When you look at the images, it's terrible. The aircraft is broken into several pieces. The ones who managed to escape were the pilots. So, the pilots were able to, because the front part, if you want, that's where you find the highest number of deaths, of fatalities. That means the front part is the one that took the most damage, except surprisingly for the cockpit. The cockpit separated at some point, it broke off. It ended up in a field. And the pilots were shaken, a little bit injured, but they were alive. So the pilots survived while many people behind them died. So the firefighters intervened, drivers stopped to help, all of that, they started getting people out. There were 99 passengers who survived, and after that, of course, the investigation began, and with it, the controversy. So one of the controversies at that time was that the co-pilot was a woman, and she was the first female airline pilot in Germany. So she found herself in the spotlight. So the media started saying, yes, is it a good idea to have a woman in the cockpit? Maybe it's because of her, when in reality, it wasn't her fault at all. There was no way for the pilots to know that what was in the tank was kerosene. And once the kerosene gets into the engines, there was nothing any pilot could have done. It was over. In any case, this pilot finds herself under fire. There's a firefighter who says, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, that he had to slap her because she was completely paralyzed. She didn't want to get out of the plane. So he had to force her a little to get out of the aircraft. What's going to happen is that she's going to disappear from the public eye for a little while. She will fly private jets, and we'll hear about her again 15 years later. That was in another plane. It was in a Cessna Citation 501. And actually, what happened is that during an approach, she's going to crash. She's going to hit an antenna. She was in another aircraft. So actually, she survived the first crash, but she died in the second one. She was taken away. And then what happened is that the private jet apparently went below the decision height, even though he couldn't see the runway. These kinds of accidents were very common at that time. And then they hit an antenna, right? So that's it. That's how she died. The captain, on the other hand, will work for the aviation authority. He will stop flying. He'll stop entering cockpits, but will continue working in aviation, specifically in regulations. That's it. Afterwards, later on, we looked into it, in that whole world of corruption, favoritism, and all that. We managed to find some scapegoats. It was the mechanic who had drained the fuel from the Boeing 7072 or 3 days before the accident. His manager as well, his supervisor. So the two guys, we're going to bring them to justice. And they were sentenced to 8 months in prison. Well, they had to be sentenced to something to please the crowd a little. So there you go, my friends. That was Pan International Flight 112. The German airline disappeared quite quickly. When I say quite quickly, there was the accident in September. By October, it was no longer flying. Because once the accident happened, it lost a lot of big contracts with tour operators. And quite quickly, it was insolvent 4 weeks later. And that's probably a good thing in some ways. So that's it, my friends. Thank you for your unwavering support for this channel. I'll see you in the next video. See you soon.